Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about protein intake and low carbohydrate diets. What does the research to date show regarding diabetes, prediabetes, and metabolic health overall with regard to the potential benefits of lower carbohydrate diets? This episode is sponsored. Commercial support has been provided by Simply Good Foods, and we thank them for their support of the podcast. Also, today's guest, Dr. Jim Painter, was sponsored by an unrestricted grant from Simply Good Foods to speak on the podcast. However, we are not discussing any products or brands today. We are submitting this to the Commission on Dietetic Registration for one free continuing education unit for dietitians, diet technicians, and diabetes educators. So if that is of interest to you, please check that out on my free CEU page at soundbitesrd.com. So as I mentioned, my guest today is Dr. Jim Painter. Dr. Painter is the director of the Master of Science in Functional and Integrative Medicine at John Patrick University and emeritus professor at Eastern Illinois University. He earned a BS in nutrition from Southern Illinois University, which is my undergraduate alma mater, and his Master of Science from Oklahoma State University. He got his PhD from the University of Illinois, and he's also a registered dietitian nutritionist. His research specialties include heart disease and mindless eating, and he has over 100 peer-reviewed publications to his credit. Welcome to the show, Dr. Painter.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Melissa. It's been a while since we did this, and it's much improved.
Oh, thank you. Yes. So, Dr. Painter, you were I think guest number 3 when the podcast launched 10 years ago. So yeah, it's been a minute, right?
Yeah.
So welcome back. It's always good to talk with you. Oh, actually, it was episode number 4. I'm looking at my notes here. So it was April of 2015. So we've known each other for about 20 years, I think, because I know we did at least one presentation together way back when I was working with the Dairy Council. We did this cheese and wine pairing at this winery out in the western suburbs of Chicago. It was so much fun.
Yes, it was.
Yes. Time flies, right? So I would love for you to share more about your background and the work that you do.
I kind of started out working it was kind of like a new hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I did that for 10 years. And then I really enjoyed the teaching part of it. So I thought I need to get a degree. So I got a master's degree accidentally over a 10-year period from 1980 to 1990. It took a long time because you have a baby and stop and start and have a baby and stop and start. So it took me 9 years to get a master's degree.
Wow.
It wasn't the most prominent thing in my life. So yeah, I did that for a while. And then I thought I'd really like to teach. And so went to University of Illinois and taught there for more than 10 years. And after that, I finally got a PhD while I was there. And went down to Eastern Illinois and was the chair of the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences for about 13 years, I think. And then stopped that in 2015 and started traveling and just speaking until COVID came in January 2020.
Mm-hmm.
One of my assistants said, get back on LinkedIn. So I did. I was only on for about a week. Someone called me and said, hey, you want to run our master's program in functional and integrative medicine? So I started that, and it just flipped from traveling the country to sitting here looking out over the ocean on a South Padre Island and teaching classes.
Excellent. Well, I'm just thrilled to have you on the podcast. This topic is very popular, and I think there's a lot of questions about, increasing protein intake, decreasing carbohydrate intake. There's a ton of things that we could talk about. So you and I kind of, had a pre-interview call where we kind of put our heads together. And both of us have a bunch of research papers in front of us. So we are going to get into some science, but also, of course, make it digestible for our listeners, which you always do a great job of it, always throwing in a side of humor as well. Maybe the best place to start, when we talk about low carbohydrate diets or lower carbohydrate diets, what exactly do we mean? Is this term defined? I think this is an important place for us to begin this conversation.
No, it is. And everybody has their different idea. So when you say low carbohydrate, you can just as well say high fat, high protein, because it's the same thing. If you take carbs away, you're going to eat fat and protein.
Mm-hmm.
A low carb diet, and people think it's a keto diet. It really is not a keto diet. A keto diet is really low. It's like a carnivore diet. Carnivore diet is like 0 grams of carbohydrate. You're just eating meat, fish, and eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And then the actual ketogenic starts at about 10%, maybe 50 grams of carbohydrate or less.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, it's less than 10% of calories from carbohydrates. And then you go up from there, and then it's just kind of a low carbohydrate diet. A low carbohydrate diet, whether it's really low, medium, or just low, can be 150 grams of carbohydrate. People go, really? Yeah, because we're eating 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrate a day.
Mm.
And so just cutting it down, there's an amazing benefit in just reducing carbohydrates a little bit from the massive amount we eat to having more fat and more protein. Does all kinds of great metabolic things in our body.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to dig into that. I did want to share that the AMDR, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range for carbohydrate, is 45 to 65% of daily caloric intake. And the recommended dietary allowance, or RDA, is 130 grams of carbohydrate. So yeah, to your point, kind of like sodium and other nutrients, we're getting a lot more than that probably. So I imagine some of the different studies that we're looking at here, I've noticed some studies define low carbohydrate at this level or very low carbohydrate at this level. So let's touch on that as needed as we go through. But thank you for kind of setting the stage there. So we, low carbohydrate, very low carbohydrate, ketogenic. What level of carbohydrate intake, and maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but we're going to talk specifically about studies, but what level of carbohydrate intake do you think is realistic or sustainable? Something that you can stick with long term, and maybe that's
right.
Something that isn't necessary. Maybe some of these lower diets do serve a temporary purpose.
I think they do. So on the temporary purpose side, people can eat carnivore and eat no carbohydrates at all for a period of time, and it's metabolically very beneficial because blood sugar drops, blood lipids drop. It's just a fantastic diet, but maybe for a couple of months. And so it is short term. But if you talk about ketogenic, less than 10% of the calories, I've known 1,000 people that did it and quit. But there are a few people that are just been on the ketogenic diet for 10 years. And I know some children, because some diseases of children that have like epilepsy or they have seizures, they'll go on a ketogenic diet and they just quit. So if you're a kid and you can go without all these episodes by eating less than 10% of your calories from carbohydrate, you do it and you're happy to do it. So people that definitely need it can do it for a long time. People that just are trying it, I know lots that didn't stay on it. I do have some friends that are just loving the ketogenic diet and probably about 10% carbs or less, and they're doing great on it. I have a friend who dropped so much weight on a ketogenic diet, and he did it for a year or so, and then he got off it, and he went back to eating it. And he came to me almost crying. He said, I can't get into ketosis anymore. I said, sure you can. Quit eating. I don't want to quit eating. Well, if you really want to get that little stick in your urine to show you're ketogenic, then don't eat. And if you fast, you will be ketogenic, but your body adjusts. After a while in a ketogenic diet, our bodies are able to make glucose better. And so it's harder to get into ketosis sometimes for people that have done it in the past. So what's the best level? I don't know. Americans are 70% either obese or overweight. Really? Yes, the whole country is. So generally for most American humans that are eating too much and they're overweight, something like a low carb diet, and it tends to be super low, you can be down at 120 grams and get amazing benefits from just eating less carbohydrate.
Okay, yeah. So that was a lot. I do want to point out that you mentioned the children and the epilepsy, and a lot of our listeners may not know that is the origin of the ketogenic diet, and it is a medically supervised diet. It's a thing. Like, it's not just, a fad diet type thing. So following up on some of what you said then, it just reminds me of like we always talk like the only diet that works is the one that you can stick with. So whether it's vegan, carnivore, somewhere in between, different strokes for different folks. Like some people are happier on one end of the spectrum or in the middle. But we're going to talk about the metabolic effects of this. You also said when we decrease our intake of carbohydrate, well, we're going to increase our protein and or fat to some extent. I mean, if it's a weight loss diet, we were probably looking at a lower caloric intake to begin with. And so percentage-wise, though, like let's say we just decrease our excess carbohydrate intake, percentage-wise, we're going to get more protein and fat, but it may not actually be that we're eating more of those things. So there's a lot of different ways to look at that. So having said that, how much protein and fat make up the rest of the diet of a lower carbohydrate diet? I mean, I think we've kind of already answered that for ourselves, but I wanted to make sure that you can address that, like how much protein and fat would be considered in a lower carbohydrate diet.
And so when you're talking about low carbohydrate and people think keto, that's 10%, and that's not the norm. You don't need to be keto to get these benefits, but then you still have 90% of your calories. So what's going to go up? Protein can't go up too much. It can go up to 25% maybe. So you're really eating more like 70% fat. People go, really? Is that good? Yes, it is. The Mediterranean diet, which is the wonderful diet for the world, is almost 50% fat. People don't, really? Yes, it is. It's 50% fat generally. And so the combination of those two, it depends what your goal is. It's hard to get a zone diet, 40% carbs, 30% fat, 30% protein. We did that in a scientist experiment one time 30 years ago. To get 30% of your calories as protein, you can't hardly eat and have only 30% fat because you're going to be eating meats that are full of fat. And so we had to feed the turkey for breakfast, turkey for lunch, and turkey for dinner.
A lot of lean protein in order to keep the fat at 30.
You just can't hardly do it. You'll eat nuts. Nope, can't have nuts.
Because of the fat.
It's because of the fat. So it will turn out to be probably double the amount of fat as protein, and which is fine because that's still pretty high protein. And it's high fat also.
So I've done a lot of podcast episodes on protein, and I will link to those in the show notes for any of our listeners who want to dial back and check those out. But as we're saying, like we're decreasing carbohydrate, lower carb. Makes sense that we're doing high or higher protein intakes. What are some of the reasons that people are so interested in protein and getting more protein? I mean, it's all the rage. What benefits are people looking for and or receiving from increasing their protein intake?
Forever, the people that are exercising, you'd always see these guys are lifting weights and they're eating steak and eating eggs. And he's doing great on it. And so it's always been to get more muscle mass. You need to eat muscle. You need to eat amino acids to be able to build muscle. And so it does do that. The thing is the muscle builders I don't care about. I care about the little lady that I was talking about. Doesn't get enough protein. And she has no muscle. She's bone and she's skin and she weighs about 92 pounds. And for those people, building muscle is a key. Because sarcopenia, you lose it. You don't have it as you get older and you need it. So protein is great for building muscle, and it does. But now we're finding out that really higher protein, lower carb, it's easier to lose weight. You just lose weight more by just having less carbohydrate and more protein and fat. So weight loss has become an important issue too. But it does a lot of things metabolically. Your body functions better when you're eating more protein. It's good for your metabolism, just eating more protein. So there's a variety of things that proteins do. And I think it's a good idea that people are trying to get the right amount of protein.
What do you say, because I hear this all the time, so what do you say to people who say, we're all getting enough protein, Americans eat enough protein or too much protein?
And that is true for some middle-aged, overweight American adults. It is true. But children, they don't always. Older adults, they don't always, and you have to work with that. And even young women, they're on a vegan diet in their bone building years from 15 to 25. And they're not getting enough protein. It's difficult. And so there's pockets of people in the United States, large pockets of people that don't get enough protein.
Right. Depends on the population and the person. So you mentioned vegan. There's plant-based proteins. And I have several episodes that address versus animal proteins. So we don't need to take a deep dive on this, but does the quality of protein matter? Should I say the type of protein matter, plant-based versus animal-based?
It does. And this has been common knowledge forever that plant proteins are not complete. You don't get all the complement of the 20, or it's really only about 10 that you need, amino acids. And so you can eat less of it and get a better quality of protein. I've just finished an article for the European Medical Association. It's going to be published in about a week, comparing dairy to non-dairy plant alternates. and they just really don't meet up. One of the things they just don't have is protein. So you drink milk a lot of times for protein, and they don't have it. They got 1 gram, milk has 8, and the gram that they have isn't as good a quality of protein, so you don't even use all that little bit of protein you have. So yeah, the kind of protein makes a big difference, and animal protein is better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of the plant-based milk alternatives have like 1 gram of protein, like you said, like almond milk, rice milk. Now, soy is more comparable to cow's milk, but all the rest, and people really need to check those labels. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. Before we jump into some of the specific research studies and aspects that we're going to tease out, I don't want to wait too late to ask this question is, what about fiber? Where does fiber fit into all of this? Most people are already not getting enough fiber in the large amounts of, or normal amounts of carbohydrates that they eat. So how can we get enough fiber if we're decreasing our carb intake?
That's a good point. There's a graphic I have that shows that when the Food Guide Pyramid came out in 1980, that we had been decreasing carbs. At that time, people jumped on the carbs. And what happened when they did, they weren't eating the whole carbs. So carbs went up, but the fiber content went the same or went down. Bummer. We've pushed these carbs so much, we didn't push whole carbs. And it's so important to get the whole grain carbs when you're getting it. When you're eating fruits and vegetables, eat the whole thing. So the answer to that is eat whole foods because you get fiber in whole foods.
And there are a lot of different sources of fiber, but to your point, we can get most of our fiber from fruits and vegetables. The grains have some, but they're not typically the higher fiber sources. But something like a carnivore diet, I don't think, since you're not getting any fruits and even like a piece of lettuce hardly with that diet, I don't think you're going to get your fiber. But for other like keto or, somewhere in between, I think, you can try to get more fiber from the fruits and vegetables. Okay, so let's talk about the research. What does the research to date show regarding the potential benefits of low-carb diets? Where should we start?
The one I'd like to start with is by Bazzano in 2014. I remember it came out, I was depressed over it because it didn't agree with what I thought. It compared the effects of low carbohydrate and low fat diets. It was a randomized control. And when I looked at it, one of the things I did expect was the fat-free diet went down, the low carb diet went up by eating more protein. That was not a significantly different finding. I expected that. And then when you look at LDL, well, it went up with the low fat diet. Really? Yes. And it went down with the low carb diet. Both of those were not significant in findings. And so the ratio of the good to bad cholesterol also improved with the low carb diet, and that was statistically significant. So that is an amazing study, and it was back in 2014. The thing that really got me, I know because the change was a 10-year Framingham risk score of dying for heart disease. It went up. Really? It went up in 3 months. It went up substantially on the low-fat diet. It stayed up for 6 months, and it stayed up for 12 months. Of all the things we can think of that would be a bad thing to happen with the low-fat diet is that it made the 10-year Framingham risk score go up. So on the low-carb diet, we're talking about death rates from heart disease. Fat's usually associated with it, but it's really not fat in the diet. And so if you eat low-carb diet, very high in fat, it drops at 3 months, drops at 6 months, and kept dropping at 12 months, which is odd because generally you get this J effect where in almost any diet, it works for a while, 3 months, 6 months it works, and by 12 months it's not working anymore. And that's not what happened here.
And this study was only 12 months long. It was still going down. So the chance, this is just sad, the chance of dying on a low fat diet was higher than a low carb diet that is full of fat and high in protein.
And I have this in front of me. This particular study defined a low carbohydrate diet as less than 40 grams per day. So would you consider that ketogenic?
Oh, yeah. That's getting down to the ketogenic area. So it is ketogenic.
Okay.
And so I understand they wanted to do this in this study 10 years ago. They wanted to get the biggest effect. And by going ketogenic, they got the biggest effect.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. What have you seen in other research? Like, how low do we need to go to start seeing some of these benefits?
Most of the studies I've looked at over the past 20 years, and a lot of the ones I have with me, are just lower carb. They're 120 grams of carbohydrate a day, and it's not trying to get down to 40 grams. So just cutting back on the carbs is beneficial, and you start to improve all those metabolic markers just by cutting down on it without going ketogenic.
Got it.
You still get the benefits.
Okay. And I think it's really important to touch on also, a lot of people think, well, yes, with weight loss, you're going to see these better outcomes, improved outcomes. But there's research that shows you get these metabolic improvements even in the absence of weight loss. So could you speak to that?
And that has been an issue from the beginning. And I remember in 1995, I was sending my students out every year, compare the low fat to the low carb diet. They came back and said, Doc, the Atkins diet won. I said, that's impossible. The Ornish diet is low fat. It's vegan. It's got to do better. I sent them out semester after semester for 5 years. And I thought, what are you doing here, students? They were coming back to me every time. The Atkins diet is the one that's working. It's why I flipped my paradigm 30 years ago on this idea of what really works to reduce weight, to improve blood lipids, to reduce blood sugar. It was the low carb, high fat, high protein diet. And as I look at these studies, really, they're almost all, unless they're saying they're ketogenic, they're looking at 120 grams of carbohydrate, which is a low carbohydrate diet.
Mm-hmm. And a more reasonable amount than 40, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about diabetes. What does the research show regarding diabetes?
The one study, I have a lot of them here, but this first one is by Luo, L-U-O. It's low carbohydrate ketogenic diets reduce cardiovascular risk factors for obese and overweight patients. Well, that's what our country is, obese and overweight, with type 2 diabetes mellitus. And it's a meta-analysis, randomized control. It's 21 studies that Luo looked at. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing. Fasting blood sugar went down significantly, 0.000. And as you'd expect, hemoglobin A1C, the long-term marker of blood sugar, went down too, 0.003. And so insulin went down significantly, 0.000. And then HOMR is a risk of insulin resistance. It went down a significant at 0.015. So it does many things besides losing weight. Weight it does do, but it does these things in addition to the weight loss.
Right. And that was published in 2022.
Right.
Are there other studies? This is a meta-analysis of RCTs, so that's pretty powerful. Are there other studies that you wanted to address with regard to diabetes?
Like I said, I started this with my students 30 years ago, and they convinced me. And now there's multiple meta-analysis. How do you show something is settled science? Well, do a meta-analysis of 20 studies that all agree. Well, that's good. But then if you keep getting meta-analysis that keep showing the same thing, that is the proof. And so there's a study by G, and it came out 2024. It was last year. And the title is The Effect of a Ketogenic Diet on Inflammation-Related Markers, Systematic Review, Meta-Analysis of Randomized Controlled Trials. That's what we want. We want to see what these randomized controlled trials do. And so meta-analysis are fun. I look at the forest plot where it shows this is it worked, and on the other side it didn't work. And so you can look at all the studies and see how significant is it. And so this shows that C-reactive protein, which is the first marker we use for inflammation, how's your body doing? C-reactive protein went down significantly. The p-value was 0.000 in these, how many studies was it? I think it was 20-something studies. I don't see it right now, but it went down, which is amazing to me. And it wasn't really consistent all the way. There were some studies that showed it increased, but overall, it showed that it decreased significantly for C-reactive protein.
Well, as you know, I'm a certified diabetes care and education specialist, and I have been for 27 years. So I pulled out my book of the 2025 Standards of Care in Diabetes, and I have the book in front of me. And I wanted to just read some of the carbohydrate-related information to address that this reduced carb intake is an acceptable approach from the American Diabetes Association perspective. So first of all, in Chapter 3, which is Prevention or Delay of Diabetes and Associated Comorbidities, it talks about lifestyle behavior change for type 2 diabetes prevention. And one of the recommendations is, quote, prescribe an eating pattern known to be effective in preventing type 2 diabetes to individuals with prediabetes. A variety of eating patterns, such as the Mediterranean style, intermittent fasting, and low carbohydrate have shown benefit, end quote. Under the medical nutrition therapy section in Chapter 5, which is facilitating positive health behaviors and well-being, there are 2 tables on nutrition therapy recommendations and macronutrient-specific recommendations, such as 5.13 says, for diabetes prevention and management of people with prediabetes or diabetes, recommend individualized meal plans that keep nutrient quality, total calories, and metabolic goals in mind, as data do not support a specific macronutrient pattern. So individualized, we hear that all the time and we know how important that is. And just reinforcing that there's no set specific macronutrient pattern. So we have that flexibility to flex up or flex down on the carb amount as needed for individuals. Another one is 5.15. Consider reducing overall carbohydrate intake for adults with diabetes to improve glycemia, as this approach may be applied to a variety of eating patterns that meet individual needs and preferences. And just a couple more that I want to mention. 5.24, emphasize minimally processed, nutrient-dense, high-fiber sources of carbohydrate, and it specifies at least 14 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. And in that same chapter, in the section on carbohydrates, it says, for people with type 2 diabetes, low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate eating patterns have been found to reduce A1C and the need for glucose-lowering medications. It also says that the wide range of definitions for a low carbohydrate eating plan poses a challenge in interpreting carbohydrate-restricted research studies. So I just wanted to call those out specifically and see if you had any comment or anything you wanted to add to that.
I was just very glad to see when they specifically said low carb eating was recommended. I mean, I thought about that in 1975, when I was starting into school, and we would make plans for diabetic diets. Okay, you get grams, 2 cookies here, 3 pieces of bread here, this, and you add up all this to 50, 55 grams of carbohydrate. And no one ever talked about low carb diets, but they put it in there now. And I'm happy to see it's in there. And the other thing is they don't really talk about sugar that much. They talk about whole food eating, which is another good idea. Eat whole foods. And it was a concentrated effort to look at sugars and just these really rapidly digesting starches. But even at that, this new guideline is, to me, wonderful. By saying low carb is important, by talking about whole foods, by not specifically talking about nutrients. And so I like it. I like what they've done.
Okay, great. What have you seen regarding prediabetes in the literature?
Many of the studies actually say that. They'll say prediabetes, diabetes. And there's not that many studies specifically on prediabetes. This is personal to me because I had prediabetes 50 years ago.
Before they called it that.
Yeah, before they called it that. They tell us, yeah, you're not diabetic. I don't want to be diabetic. What can I do? No, come back in 5 years. We'll look at it again. I thought, you're joking. And so the idea is generally, and it doesn't work in every area of life, but with sugar metabolism, prediabetes and diabetes, the studies do the same thing to both. If you have prediabetes, it's just a much smaller form of diabetes.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about other benefits that we would see. You touched on inflammation and C-reactive protein. What other benefits might we see? I mean, we've talked about weight as well, but are there others?
Yeah, there's many of them. And so people talk about, I lost weight, and that's great. And I don't really care if you lost weight, but when you lose weight, then your blood sugar goes down. Just does every single time. I mean, if my blood sugar was up, I think this is stupid. I'm just not going to eat now for 15 hours and then eat again, and it's down normal. But it's not just that, it's triglycerides. You eat too much of anything, you get triglycerides. And so when you start changing your diet and you're losing weight, just the fact of a body losing fat mass, muscle mass, getting smaller, your blood lipids, triglycerides drop. LDL goes down. HDL sometimes goes up, sometimes it doesn't. But your markers of fat metabolism in your body change, and long-term marker of blood sugar, hemoglobin A1C, drops too when you just start changing the direction. I've been gaining weight for 55 years. Well, if you switch that and just start losing weight, you end up improving all of these metabolic indicators.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned not eating for 15 hours, and that makes me think of intermittent fasting. So not too long ago, I did an episode on intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. And then I ended up actually submitting a proposal to FNCE, our annual dietitian conference, for this researcher that I had interviewed, Dr. Krista Verity. And the session got accepted. And so I served as a moderator for that session. We actually specifically addressed in this session, more so than the episode that I did with her, the intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating and diabetes. So I was wondering if you had any comments or insights to share about intermittent fasting and what you've seen in the literature and how it might fit into our conversation today.
Well, we can begin now and we can stop after breakfast tomorrow morning. I have a PowerPoint slide with 350 different studies, but I'm going to share just one.
Okay.
It's just one. It's one of my favorite ones. And it's called Impact of Intermittent Fasting on Health and Disease Process by Mattson. It was done in 2017. I have questions all the time, and people can't answer my questions. I used to ask medical doctors, scientists, what is it that causes you to go into ketosis? Nobody knew. Really? And how does it happen? I'd like to do a whole series with you just on getting into ketosis and what that does to your body in general, but also to autophagy, your body eating itself. But I found this study. It's amazing, by Mattson, and it just shows that if you eat breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack throughout the day, how many ketones do you make? None. None? Yeah, none, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you say, I'm going to eat today and not eat tomorrow. So you eat tonight and you don't eat all night, and then you don't eat breakfast. By about 11 o'clock, you start making ketones. And so you make ketones all day, all night until you eat the next morning at 6. You make a huge amount of ketones. But my question was, does intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, does it work? And the answer was yes. So they also have in this a wonderful diagram. So if your group out there is going to come to your site and get something, get the Mattson study, because it shows that at this they ate at 2, 5, and 8 o'clock. And so they ate for a 6-hour period. And then they didn't eat after that. So midnight came, they didn't eat. Breakfast came, they didn't eat. Then they quit eating at 8. And so by the next day, by about 9 o'clock, they started making ketones. Oh. So they made it all day from 9 to 12 p.m., past noon to 2 o'clock. So for 6 hours, they made ketones. And so the answer for the question is, how long do you have to not eat before you start making ketones? At least 12 hours, and 14 is better. From 14 to 16 to 18 hours, you just make ketones. And if we could talk about something that's wonderful, ketones do so much. And so I look at this study by Mattson, and it's amazing. It taught me that, yes, if you don't eat for a period of 12 to 14 hours, you start making ketones. So you can make ketones every single day by just eating fewer hours of the day.
Okay. And like I said, I mean, I'll link to that episode in my show notes as well. And just interestingly, and I think this kind of speaks to what we've touched on a little bit here, is I believe in the intermittent fasting research, the alternate day fasting had better results than the restricting daily windows of eating, but the adherence was not as good long term.
If you've ever tried doing that, it's hard.
Yeah.
To eat one day and not eat the next, eat one day and not eat the next. The problem comes is not the day that you don't eat. It's the day that you eat. You can't eat enough. If you want to lose weight, just do that. Because you can't eat enough in one day for 2 days. It's just not possible. Mm-hmm. And people get so tired of it. I've had people try it. I've never, ever seen anyone stay on that. Mm-hmm. Ever.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, Dr. Verity kept saying, because I was like, well, but the results are so much more significant. I want people to know that. And she's like, yeah, but nobody sticks with it. I'm like, okay.
That is very true.
Yeah. Changing gears a little bit, we've been discussing how lower carb diets impact diabetes management. But I hear this question a lot, so I'd like to ask you, does excessive carbohydrate intake or sugar intake cause diabetes?
Well, absolutely not, in the fact that it doesn't really cause it, but it shows you if you have it. And so if you are having trouble metabolizing carbohydrates and your blood sugar is going up, then in that instance, the sugar you eat is causing the diabetes. Because if you didn't eat the sugar, it would stop. And so when someone says, is it remission or is it cure? And you get remission or cure, I think you can get a cure if you just don't eat sugar. So in the big picture, it doesn't cause diabetes. But if you have diabetes, it'll show you that you have it.
Yeah, I always tell people there are some people who can be overweight and eat a lot of sugar and they're never going to get diabetes. They're just not genetically predisposed to it.
Right.
But if you are, then that's a surefire way to trigger it and make it show up. Is type 2 diabetes genetic? You mentioned remission or cure. Like, is it reversible?
I found out it was reversible when I was 15. My dad lost his pilot's license because he had high blood sugar. He was about 40 pounds overweight. He lost 30 pounds in a short period of time. He went back and he got his license back. Well, really? You can reverse type 2 diabetes? Yes. He got his pilot's license back. So even when I was studying the literature, it was going up and down. Is it possible? Is it not possible? I knew it was possible the whole time. And then I read this study by Goldberg. It was published in 2020. And it's called The Efficacy and Safety of Low and Very Low Carbohydrate Diets for Type 2 Diabetes Remission. So it's actually looking at remission, stopping the type 2 diabetes. And so what Goldberg found was fascinating. In fact, over a period of time, all these studies in this meta-analysis were 12 weeks or less, and they were randomized at 130 grams or less of carbohydrate. That's what we were talking about earlier, 26% of the calories. And then they did a very low carb diet at 10, and both functioned well.
10 grams a day?
No, 10%.
10%. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. 10 grams, that's really low.
Like, why even bother? Why even
Not
bother?
anything but...
That's a cup of broccoli.
That's right. That's right. And so, he looked at the remission rates, and he found that those people that had low risk, the studies that had low risk of bias, they found out that they all reduced the blood sugar, and the p-value was 0.001. Then they looked at the studies that had high risk or some risk of bias in their studies. They still had a p-value of 0.009, and they almost all lost weight too, and their blood sugar normalized. So can you go into remission? I think you can. I mean, I've seen it personally in my family, and then I've seen it with so many people that really take the weight off and they keep it off.
Yes. And I mean, it is a progressive disease. So if you're younger and you get it and you're doing a great job with your diet and lifestyle, it could progress at some point as we age. That's another one of the risk factors, right? And I always tell my patients, you want to do the best you can with your diet and lifestyle. But at a certain point, if you do need some help from medication, it doesn't mean that you failed. It is a progressive disease. So is there a best diet for diabetes? I mean, we already talked about it needs to be individualized, but in your opinion and looking at the literature?
I think generally, like I said, for the people that need it, the average American, 73% of us are overweight or obese. What is the best diet for those people? It's a low carbohydrate diet. Is low carbohydrate best for everybody? Well, I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about diabetes, pre-diabetes. For them, it's almost certainly the best diet, a low carbohydrate diet. Are there some people that can't for some reasons? Yes, you're pregnant, you're nursing, you're very young or very old. Is there a reason it might not work? Yeah, because sometimes people just need to eat food. Well, I won't eat anything but sugar. Fine, just eat it then, because you don't have any weight on you. But generally, for everybody that is middle-aged, older, and it is high blood sugar, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, the low carbohydrate is the best.
And the Mediterranean diet, it's like ranked number one diet all the time. And we touched on it briefly before, but you're saying like the Mediterranean diet can be considered a lower carb diet.
And think about it. They eat a lot of pasta. Yeah, they do, but they eat a lot of whole foods. They eat a lot of meats, and they eat a lot of vegetables, they eat fruits. And so the Mediterranean diet, I think, is a wonderful diet. It is a high-fat diet. It is a lower carbohydrate diet, and it's pretty moderate in protein levels. And there's a study called PREDIMED, and I got to know one of the authors about 10 years ago. It was done from 2003 to 2013, and they compared three groups. They had some people eating their normal amount of food, normal breakdown of their food. And then they had two groups that were on the Mediterranean diet. And so they gave one group was a Mediterranean diet with extra olive oil. Well, really? And they had a second group was Mediterranean diet with extra nuts. Really? So they had too high fat. Then they had a third group that was, we want you to just cut back on fat. You need to eat less fat. And so they did. If they cut the fat, fat was in their diet was at about 37%, 39%. They were 39%. And the two heavy fat diets went from 39 up to 41%, which is about where we were in the 50s when they said you eat too much fat. Which is exactly what those people were eating. And then they took a low fat group and they went from that 39 to 37. That's it. It's 2% difference, 39 to 37 and 39 to 41 and 41. After 4.5 years, they noticed, wait a minute, there's one group that's dying way too fast. Whose group is that? They looked at the data and they found out that those people on the low fat, 37% fat, were dying at a significantly higher rate than those on the high fat 2 levels of a Mediterranean diet. So is a Mediterranean diet good? Yeah, it has been. It's been a good diet for the last 5,000 years.
Okay. Very good. So would you suggest that people first kind of get a feel for how much carbohydrate and protein and fat, I guess, that they're eating, and then make some adjustments from there and kind of see what kind of results they get and how well they feel like they can stick with it?
Yeah, it is probably a good idea to see how much you're doing without people going too nutsy and weighing their food and counting the carbs.
Right.
And it's difficult to do, but to just assess your diet and look at it and see how are you eating a lot of carbs? You having cereal for breakfast and you having, a sandwich and bread for lunch and you're having rolls and pizza for dinner, then that's a lot of carbohydrate, and to try cutting back on it, to have a low carb diet that's cutting, a third of them out is amazingly beneficial.
Very good. As we're wrapping up, I would love for you to share some sort of bottom line takeaways for our listeners, keeping in mind that, some of our listeners are dietitians and healthcare professionals, but we also have the general public listening as well.
I think that the main thing is eat whole foods. And someone says, wait, should I be vegan or should I be paleo or carnivore? You didn't hear what I said. Eat whole foods. But which one should I do? It really depends on your metabolism, what diet is best for you. And I say, and they said, you've been studying this for 50 years? Yes, 50 years. And the only thing you can say is eat whole foods? Yes, eat whole foods. That's the first thing I say. And no matter what diet you go on. But then the next thing I say is really low carb diets for Americans living in the age we're in today is better to cut back on the carbs.
Okay, very good. Where can people find out more about this topic and connect with you?
They can connect with me on my website. I'm on LinkedIn, and I've got a YouTube channel too.
Oh, okay, great. I didn't know about the YouTube channel. I'll have to check that out. And of course, I'll have links to your LinkedIn, your website, any of the research articles that we talked about. I will try to link to at least the abstracts. If they're open access, I will link to those as well. I'll put as much as I can into the show notes at soundbitesrd.com. There's also, I'll link to the 2025 Diabetes Standards of Care information, and then the simplygoodfoodscompany.com about us section so people can learn about that. And you also wanted me to include a visual in the show notes. Do you want to talk about that visual briefly?
Well, I talked about that a little bit already, and it's just talking about how long do you need to go before you stop eating that you get this benefit of increasing the right things in your diet. And so when you talk about how long do you have to eat, it's a nice little diagram. It's from the Matson study.
The intermittent fasting sort of.
Intermittent fasting.
Okay.
And how long do you have to not eat? And it's really 12, 14 hours starts the benefit. It goes great for as long as you can keep your mouth shut.
Okay. Yeah, we'll include that visual as well. That would be helpful for our listeners if they want to come to the show notes at soundbitesrd.com. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Painter, for coming on the show and sharing all this information with us.
Thank you, Melissa. It has been a privilege.
And for everybody listening, if you liked this episode, please share it with a friend, tell a friend or colleague about the podcast. And as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. This podcast does not provide medical advice. It is for informational purposes only. Please see a registered dietitian for individualized advice. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Copyright Soundbites Inc., all rights reserved.